Well, it's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Lucia Gahlin, who is a renowned Egyptologist. Lucia is Honorary Research Associate at University College London's Institute of Archaeology. She has worked for many, many months in Egypt. She has led tours there and is an absolute expert. Tonight, she's going to be talking to us about the amazing new museum, and her talk is called Everywhere, the Glint of Gold, Tutankhamun's Treasures at the Grand Egyptian Museum. So welcome, Lucia. Fabulous to have you giving us a lecture this evening.
Oh, thank you, Susanna. That's a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And it's lovely to be with you this evening. Thank you so much for inviting me to give another lecture for this wonderful program of lectures that you organise. And a real pleasure to be speaking to you this evening about the new Grand Egyptian Museum and focusing on Tutankhamun's treasures displayed in their entirety for the first time ever in the Grand Egyptian Museum. So here it is, a museum that reflects the landscape. The pyramids only 2 kilometers away, and a museum that we have been able to visit since 2024 because it has been partially open since 2024, displaying a chronologically arranged selection of highlights of ancient Egyptian art and culture. But it's only been open in its entirety since November. So it's a really, really new, fully open museum, and it's stunning. Just to say that it was designed by an Irish architect firm, a Dublin-based firm named Hennigan Peng Architects, who won the commission to design this new museum back in 2003. And it is huge, 168,000 square meters. It's the largest museum in the world dedicated to one civilization. So we enter the museum past an obelisk, of course we do, and it was erected back in the 13th century BC by this pharaoh, who we say hello to as we enter the museum. This is Ramesses II of the 13th century BCE, a colossal statue. We walk past the statue as we enter the museum. We say hello to Ramesses II, we walk past Ramesses II, and we take a left turn up this magnificent staircase, peppered with statues of ancient Egyptian pharaohs and gods. And when we get to the top of that staircase, we look out at the pyramids, which, as I say, are only a couple of kilometers away. They are the pyramids of ancient Egypt, the pyramids at Giza. Now, since 2024, it has only been half of the museum, well, actually less than half of the museum, open as part of a soft opening. And we have been able to visit these 12 chronologically arranged galleries, taking us from before the formation of the ancient Egyptian state, so that's before 3000 BCE, all the way through to the Roman period in Egypt. But we are making our way through these galleries to what we call the New Kingdom galleries. And a highlight pharaoh for me is always the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, this magnificent statue of her. We take a left turn at Hatshepsut in the chronologically arranged galleries, and we start our exploration of the galleries that have only now been open for, well, 3 months now, almost exactly 3 months now. And these are the galleries that display for the first time all the objects discovered in 1922 in the Valley of the Kings in the tomb of the Pharaoh Tutankhamun. Whether you've visited the Egyptian Museum, the old Egyptian Museum in Cairo in Tahrir Square, whether you have been able to get to one of the exhibitions over recent decades around the world, you will never have seen all the treasures discovered in that tomb. We are talking 5,398. The number is phenomenal. And you can see that from looking at this plan that the objects are displayed in a variety of grouped themes. So we have lifestyle, we have the daily life of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh. We have his identity as a pharaoh. We have the funeral. We've got the religious beliefs around the funerary religion, beliefs about rebirth into an afterlife, and of course, the discovery of the tomb itself. Now, on any tour to Egypt, we also visit the Valley of the Kings. So we visit the tomb of Tutankhamun, which is nestled in the heart of the valley. In fact, it's pretty much exactly there. And we're looking down into the Valley of the Kings, which is on the west side of the River Nile in Luxor. And we visit the tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and we're blown away by just how small it is. And then when we couple that with now being able to explore all the treasures discovered in this tomb, it really blows one's mind to visit the tomb and to then also be able to explore the galleries upon galleries of treasures. Now, when we're in the tomb, we also get to see the image of Tutankhamun painted on the walls, as you see top right there, which is just a detail of a painting on the wall of the burial chamber. So the burial chamber is one of just 4 rooms, as you can see them on the plan there. These names, burial chamber, treasury, antechamber, annex, these are modern names. And if you look at the diagram bottom right, you can see that they really were jam-packed with this huge range of treasures. Now, we know that Tutankhamun came to the throne when he was a boy. We think he was 7, 8, or 9 years old. And when we look at the iconography from his tomb, he is represented in a very childlike way. Now, all the images you're seeing this evening are photographs I've taken in the new Grand Egyptian Museum of Tutankhamun's treasures, unless I have said otherwise in the labeling on the slides. And there are only a tiny number of objects that are in other museum collections that I'm using to just make some additional points. So when you look at the image on the left, you are seeing the image of a newborn baby, Tutankhamun as a newborn baby, with that squashed skull of the newborn baby, but very importantly, emerging from a water lily. For the ancient Egyptians, the water lily opening in the morning, having risen out of the water, was synonymous with sunrise. And then in the evening, the water lily closes and sinks back under the water. So this is Tutankhamun as a divine solar child. And this is tied in with the ancient Egyptian funerary religion, the idea of rebirth. So when we look at the iconography, when we look at the imagery of Tutankhamun from his tomb, we have to read the symbolism. And I just wanted you to note that very particular skull shape there, because to the right, you're looking at one of the so-called Amarna princesses. On our tours to Egypt, we visit the site of Amarna. That's where Tutankhamun was born. That's where he spent his early years. And he was, we think, the half-brother of a number of girls, one of whom you see a representation of on the right, represented in a very particular way. These were the children of the Pharaoh Akhenaten, a particularly interesting pharaoh who made changes to the religious belief and to the art. And we see this very particular way of representing the children of Akhenaten as these divine solar children, with this emphasis on the sun in the ancient Egyptian religion, in the ideology of Egyptian kingship, in the ancient Egyptian funerary religion. Now, even when he ascended to the throne, as we've established, Tutankhamun was still a child, 7, 8, 9 years old. He looks more boy-like rather than baby-like in this image on the left. But again, we can't say that this is true portraiture. It is a feel for Tutankhamun as a boy king. We know, for example, he had pierced ears, as we see on what we believe to be a mannequin on the left there. We know he had pierced ears, but these are very typical features you see here of the iconography of Tutankhamun. So those high cheekbones, the full cheeks, the small rounded chin, the large eyes, as I say, the pierced ears, are typical of how Tutankhamun is represented. Now, it's Howard Carter, the director of the excavations during which this fabulous tomb was discovered, who suggested this was a mannequin and suggested that one of Tutankhamun's fine garments would have been placed over the shoulders of this mannequin that perhaps would have stood in the royal wardrobe of the palace or maybe in a side room of the temple. So we don't know for sure, but it appears that this is a functional object. But what's interesting is that the marks on the surface of this wooden, plastered, and painted and partially gilded mannequin, those marks do suggest that this figure possibly wore a jeweled corselet. And there's an example of such a bejeweled corselet on the right there. I've never seen that on display before. So much of what is on display at the Grand Egyptian Museum from the mass of Tutankhamun's treasures, so much is being actually displayed for the first time. And that's what makes this new museum so exciting. So much of what we see has never been on display before. Now, I'm familiar with the archive of record cards and photographs from this discovery. And what's so wonderful is that we can all be familiar with these because they're online, they're digitized. So Howard Carter's original drawings and sketches, his original descriptions, and Harry Burton's original photographs are all on the Griffith Institute website. Look it up if you've never had a look at it. The University of Oxford in the UK has a website for the Griffith Institute. You'd find it very easily. The part of the website focusing on these records is entitled Tutankhamun, Anatomy of an Excavation. So being familiar with these record cards, being familiar with the photographs, and then seeing objects that have never been displayed before, such as Tutankhamun's linen glove, a photograph I took bottom right in the Grand Egyptian Museum recently, it makes the objects really even more exciting to have never been able to actually look at them before and to only know them from photographs and drawings. Now, this linen glove was discovered in this chest. You're looking at one of Harry Burton's original photographs taken at the time of the discovery. There's a chest. Everything looks in rather a state, doesn't it? That's also quite mind-boggling. We do know that this tomb was partially robbed at least twice, not long after the original sealing of the tomb. And I also think that Tutankhamun's death heralded the beginning of a sort of new era of ancient Egyptian history and an attempt to forget a ruling family synonymous with change that had been too revolutionary for the ancient Egyptian psyche. So I think Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten, particularly, had made changes to the religion and to kingship that had been too conceptually problematic for the ancient Egyptians. So I think on Tutankhamun's death, the son of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's death, I think that they just put everything into that tomb from the palace, desperately trying to forget that particular royal family. Now, while we've got this photo on the screen, have a look at this chair. Again, you'd hardly notice it, but as soon as it's on display in what I'll call the gem from now on, that's how we tend to refer to this museum these days. This is lovely because this is one of 6 chairs found in Tutankhamun's tomb, and one of 10 foot rests found in his tomb. And it is definitely a chair for a child. And I love the fact that some of these treasures found in Tutankhamun's tomb are so clearly made for a child. The child-size linen glove, the child-size beautiful ebony and ivory chair here, with those scenes of nature in the gold foil. You can imagine as a child, Tutankhamun sitting on that chair and enjoying those little vignettes of nature. And actually, there's a whole display focusing on objects that are specifically from Tutankhamun's early childhood. And in fact, what we often have actually written on the chests are little audits of what's actually inside the various chests and boxes. And I love the fact that these little boxes and chests you're looking at here actually specify that this is equipment in them for His Majesty as a child. And then it lists what's in the boxes. So things like razors. And I love the 3 grasshoppers of gold. Tutankhamun seems to have had a particular fascination for grasshoppers, and we'll come back to that. But along the bottom there, as if laid out in his robing room, in his wardrobe, we've got a little row of sandals. And again, we think of that glint of gold in Howard Carter's words, the title of my lecture. But it's much more than gold. The treasures are much more than gold. Those little pairs of sandals, that for me is the treasure from this tomb, getting that insight into this boy king. And we go from that little row of sandals to the remarkable throne. Remarkable because it's stunning, gilded wood with inlay, but remarkable for so much more than sheer sort of aesthetic excitement. We need to home in on what's going on the back panel of that throne. And what's interesting is that the style is heavily influenced by Tutankhamun's father. So Tutankhamun is seated on the throne. It's a languid feel to the pose. He's got a low-slung kilt with his belly overhanging. So much of this is the style of his father. But there is a return to the traditional style of art. And it's that combination of the two that's so fascinating. Tutankhamun is attended by his wife, who seems to be anointing him with scented oil. She's got a dish in her left hand, and she's touching his body with her right. She's wearing an inlaid silver gown, and for the ancient Egyptians, silver was imported, so it's much more precious to them than the gold that they had in the eastern desert of the Nile Valley. Beneath the rays of the sun, and that's what's very important. If we look to the central position at the top of the throne, just take a look at the sun disk there. It wears a cobra on its brow, a uraeus. It has rays emanating from it with hands holding up the sign you might just see of life, the ankh to the nostrils of the royal couple. This is in fact the god Aten that Tutankhamun's father Akhenaten elevated to a position as sole god following centuries and centuries of polytheistic religion. Tutankhamun's reign saw a return to that polytheistic religion, but this is a huge statement. We have, during the reign of Tutankhamun, a throne with a feature of that one solar deity of his father's reign. And it's worth mentioning here that we think of the pharaoh as Tutankhamun, and in fact, of course, for most of his reign, he was called Tutankhamun. But when he was born, he was given a name that appears on this throne. So if we go to the outside panel of the right arm, as if we were sitting on the throne there, the right arm panel, and we look to the cartouche, the name of the pharaoh written in that oval cartouche, we read in the hieroglyphs, Tutankhamun, the living image of Aten, the god Aten. Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten's one solar deity, Aten, centrally positioned there on the back of the throne. This is the name that this young prince was given when he was born. This is a name he actually still had when he was crowned pharaoh of Egypt. Only 2, 3, 4 years into his reign did he change his name to the name that appears on this wonderful cartouche-shaped box from his tomb, Tutankhamun, the living image of the god Amun, king of the gods, one of many gods, the god of Luxor. And in fact, his wife, who was also his half-sister, we think, whose name originally was Ankh-Aten, the one who lives for the Aten, she becomes Ankh-Amun. This is an incredibly important, culturally, religiously, politically important period of ancient Egyptian history. And the treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb, on display in their entirety for the first time, present us with this fabulous, fabulous picture of what was going on. So Tutankhamun becomes a pharaoh, still Tutankhaten for the first 2, 3, 4 years of his reign. And he's presented there with his staff of office in one hand and his mace in the other hand, one of 2 statues flanking the entrance to his burial chamber. We have it all. We go to Tutankhamun's tomb and we see the image of Tutankhamun on the wall holding a mace, wooden handled and stone headed. We look back at the photographs and we see the statues in situ where he is holding a ceremonial version of such a mace, gilded and wooden. And then we go to the gem and we see those ceremonial maces, the regalia of ancient Egyptian kingship, coupled with the staff of office. Statues of Tutankhamun that are the same size as he was. We know that they are images in an idealized way of the pharaoh himself. And for the first time ever, we have all 130 sticks and staves that were found in Tutankhamun's tomb on display. And they are staffs of office. They are ceremonial, and many of them have the heads of the generic, stereotyped foreigners, the enemies of Egypt, the Nubians, the Sudanese to the south, the images of the Levantine people, Syria, Palestine, and that part of the world that the ancient Egyptians also created a stereotype of in order to control these enemies, the foreigners beyond the borders of Egypt, so that Tutankhamun could grab the stick or the stave, that he could control in this key role of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh to control the chaos of the outside world, to control the foreigner, to control the wild animals, the potential chaos of nature. A key role of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh, this identity of the Egyptian pharaoh expressed beautifully in these treasures, whether they be these incredibly detailed, carved ebony heads on these gilded wooden sticks, or whether they be the symbolism of the lion, the might, the strength, the power of the lion's body with the pharaoh's head. Don't think about the female idea of the Greek Sphinx. Think about the ancient Egyptian, very sort of masculine, strong image of the Egyptian pharaoh, the great Sphinx at Giza, which we then find recurring in the iconography on the wonderful painted wooden box from Tutankhamun's tomb, on the fabulous ceremonial shields. And that detail on the right there is this box here. You've seen this photograph before. It's just lots of fun to see the treasures at the gem and then find them in Harry Burton's wonderful archaeological photographs, which you can download for yourselves in high resolution from the Griffith Institute website. So there's the box. They've displayed it close to the chariots found in Tutankhamun's tomb, because in fact, the major scenes painted on this lovely box are of Tutankhamun in his chariot, pulled by his two horses, firing his composite bow into the fray. He is controlling the foreigners, the enemies of Egypt, and in other scenes, he's controlling the wild animals, particularly the lions of the Eastern Desert. It's very hard to photograph the chariots. They're really wonderfully displayed, but it's very hard to get a good photograph of them. But 6 chariots were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. They were actually found flat packed in his tomb. You see them here on the left there. So they have been put back together. And they were found together with almost 50 bows of various types and sizes. You see a selection of them there on the left. Some of them show signs of use. Several are child-sized, which again is just that lovely connection with Tutankhamun as a living being and not just a historical figure. There were some arrows also found in the tomb, and they're on display as well. And some of those are of the type used in battle, and some of them are of the type used in hunting and training. What has never been on display before is this unique example of body armor made of leather scales. And it is particularly the clothing that I just find connects us with Tutankhamun, and all the clothing found in his tomb is on display in the gem. Together with other weaponry, we've got a large quantity of weaponry found in Tutankhamun's tomb, and I thought you might enjoy some of Howard Carter's drawings. He was a very skilled artist. He actually went to Egypt initially in 1890-91, so that would have been 30 years or so before the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. He was working in Egypt for 30 years before he discovered the tomb, and he went to Egypt as an artist. And so he drew the placement of these two daggers, the gold-bladed dagger and the iron-bladed dagger, both, of course, on display at the Gem. And the iron blade is the largest known object made of meteoric iron from ancient Egypt. Now, it's always interesting just to go back to this drawing, I think, just to remind us of these 4 small rooms, chock-a-block with these treasures. So much of the what we see relates to everyday life and the identity of the pharaoh, and so much of what we see is ceremonial and is ritual. So let's explore some more of these ceremonial and ritual objects. And we're in the antechamber, and we're looking in as Howard Carter and his team would have first viewed these treasures when they first peered into the initial room when one enters the tomb from the bottom of the descending staircase and then descending corridor. And what you're looking at is almost too much to take in, but I want you to just notice that there are head to tail 3, and we're just really seeing the central one there, fabulous ceremonial beds. Now, recently there has been a project to digitally colour some of these photographs, and again, you can also download these from the Griffith Institute website. These ceremonial beds are on display. It's sometimes difficult to get good photos because of all the reflection, but I quite enjoy the reflections that are going on as well in some of these photographs. So these gilded wooden ceremonial beds. Now, exactly how they were used, the function they actually took, is hard to establish. We do know that the body of the pharaoh and anyone else who could afford the luxury of embalming and mummification, we know that it took place on a lion-headed bed of this kind of type. So whether there was some kind of ceremonies around the embalming process and mummification, we don't know exactly how these large gilded wooden beds were actually used. But and why on earth one would need three of them, I don't know. But fabulous to see them alongside each other, displayed in a way like never before, and rather peculiar that underneath what was clearly a ritual ceremonial bed, we have got Tutankhamun's packed lunches, packed dinners for eternity. This is what we are looking at in these boxes below. We are looking at vast quantities of boxed, preserved meat. And we know that a big part of the funerary rituals for an ancient Egyptian was to ensure that they were sustained for eternity, that they would be reborn into an afterlife where they would require food and drink for eternity. And Tutankhamun had plenty of food and plenty of drink. More than 30 wine jars were found in his tomb, many labeled with the date, the type of wine, the vineyard, and even the chief winemaker. So you can probably see the hieroglyph stamped on the stopper here. But what you also need to be aware of is in the cursive script we call hieratic, there is in fact a further wine label, quite literally, on the side of the jar there. Now, what I'd like to do is take us into the burial chamber. We haven't been in there yet. We've been thinking particularly about this antechamber. Let's go into the burial chamber. Now, the burial chamber, when it was discovered back in 1922, they removed the blocking in the doorway here, Harry Burton's photograph again, and they could see that this chamber was entirely filled with a gilded wooden inlaid shrine. You see it at the bottom here, bottom right. A gilded wooden inlaid shrine, which turned out to have another one inside that, and another one inside that, and another one inside that. The outer one is the most spectacular one because it has this lovely blue faience inlay. And it's lovely the way they've displayed these with the doors open, because the inside is all decorated too with various funerary texts and funerary images, spells from the Book of the Dead and some of the myths of the ancient Egyptian funerary religion. But it really was this Russian doll effect of a shrine within a shrine within a shrine within a shrine. And inside that inner shrine of the four shrines was a lovely quartzite sarcophagus. They have left that in situ. And until fairly recently, the lid of the sarcophagus was on the floor next to it, and there was a glass lid on the sarcophagus, and the outer of three coffins was still in that sarcophagus, and the body of Tutankhamun was in that. And that is how it was until about, I don't remember exactly when they did it, possibly about 15 years ago, 10 years ago, they moved the body of Tutankhamun out and they put it on display in the antechamber. And then it was 2010 that they removed the coffin, the outer coffin, for the first time. And at that point, they put the lid back on. You can see it's got a crack across it. Interestingly, the lid is actually of granite, painted to look like quartzite, painted in antiquity to look like quartzite. Quartzite for the ancient Egyptians has a solar symbolism. It's that lovely crystalline, sparkly, pinky, yellowy, reddy color that gives it a solar association. And the idea of the sun setting and the sun rising was so important to ancient Egyptian funerary religion. The idea of the pharaoh joining the sun to journey through the underworld to be reborn like the sun in the morning. And we know that this period of ancient Egyptian history, it particularly emphasizes the solar in the religion. So we can appreciate the use of quartzite as a stone charged with solar significance. Inside that sarcophagus, sitting in its base, was this. Now, I don't recall having ever seen this before. I don't think it was ever on display at the Egyptian Museum, the old Egyptian Museum. But here it is. And I love the fact it's slightly bowed, because sitting on it was a coffin with a coffin inside that, with a coffin inside that. And inside that, the body of Tutankhamun with his extraordinary funerary mask. Now, when we look at photographs, in fact, taken back in 1925, this one by Harry Burton, of Howard Carter with an Egyptian colleague looking into the coffin, what we're looking at is the inner coffin inside the middle coffin. The outer of the three coffins was, as I say, left inside the sarcophagus, and I had only seen photographs of it. Harry Burton's wonderful photographs. This coffin, gilded wooden outer coffin, cypress wood, gilded and partly inlaid, it was left inside the sarcophagus in Tutankhamun's tomb until 2010. When it was taken to what were then the basement conservation labs at the Grand Egyptian Museum. And so it has only gone on display for the first time ever in November. And here it is. Before November, we were aware it was, until 2010, inside the sarcophagus that we could see when we visited Tutankhamun's tomb. We could see the sarcophagus, but we couldn't see inside, and we couldn't see this. So we're seeing this for the first time. And I love the fact that the outer of the three coffins, was slightly too long for the sarcophagus. So its foot end was shorn off a little. It had to be adapted slightly to fit inside the sarcophagus. But inside this was this gilded wooden inlaid coffin. And inside this was this solid gold coffin, 111 kilograms of gold. And I did a little Google, and right now, apparently, 111 kilograms of gold are worth approximately 16 million US dollars. So this coffin was actually found with, as Harry Burton's photograph on the right there shows, was found with that collar or garland of flowers. Those are actual flowers, leaves, berries, fruit, and they're sewn onto a papyrus backing. And it's possible to suggest that those particular flowers and fruit most likely suggest that he would have been buried in March or April. And we know that there was a 70-day period between the death of a pharaoh and the funeral. So that would suggest that he died in January or February. And we can suggest that thanks to the kinds of plants and fruit that are then found in the floral displays and bouquets that amazingly survive and were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. So once the lid was taken off that particular solid gold coffin, there was the funerary mask. And it's displayed in such a way in the Grand Egyptian Museum that one can get up close to it. And it is possible for the first time to photograph it. So although it's been possible to photograph Tutankhamun's treasures in the old museum for a while now, they never let us photograph the funerary mask. But it's now possible to get a photograph up close, as I've done here recently, of the solid gold funerary mask of Tutankhamun, inlaid with some semi-precious stones, but mostly what you're looking at there is blue glass. Often people don't realize that, but most of what you're looking at, all the stripes on the headdress there, are in fact not lapis lazuli, they are blue glass. Tutankhamun's body was embalmed, obviously. That's what the ancient Egyptians did for royal family and elite bodies. We know that the limbs and toes were wrapped separately, and each individual toe and finger had a golden stole capping it, as you can see on the left there. And he was wearing gold sandals. So that's once all the mummification wrappings were removed. In fact, there were about 150 objects wrapped into the bandages. Wonderful, wonderful jewelry. And I love the fact that the Grand Egyptian Museum curatorial team have taken Howard Carter's drawings and incorporated them into the way they display the objects. And all those original drawings, as I say, you can have a look at, you can download for yourself from the Griffith Institute website. So you can see, for example, that he really was wearing this extraordinary number of gold collars. You can see for the drawing on the right, and then they're all displayed in the gem. There's actually a spell in the Book of the Dead. It's spell number 158, and it's a protective spell, and it's to be recited, I quote, over a collar of gold inscribed with the spell and placed on the neck of the deceased on the day of burial. So there is a significance to this jewelry. It was never meant to be purely decorative. He was also found, as you can see from Howard Carter's drawing, with a rather ridiculous number of bracelets, wearing a number of bracelets. And I couldn't resist homing in on these two. They're all there in the gem, but I'm homing in on these two. And the reason I'm homing in on these two is because they're stunning, and they emphasize that scarab beetle image, which ties in with the idea of the rising sun. For the ancient Egyptians, they observed nature. They saw the dung beetle or scarab beetle rolling the ball of dung. They equated that with the movement of the sun over the horizon. But it's also a very important element of the writing of Tutankhamun's throne name. So it recurs. But I want you to notice that bracelet at the bottom there. And the clasp to the right, if we look at it at right angles, we see that it is a grasshopper or a locust, as Howard Carter refers to it in his registration card there. I mentioned that Tutankhamun liked grasshoppers. And actually, there's another royal funerary spell. It is found on the internal walls of the early pyramids. So we call it a pyramid text. And it's pyramid text number 467. And it's where the pharaoh declares, "I have reached the sky like a grasshopper." So again, we have to be aware of the texts, the ancient Egyptian texts. We have to marry those with the objects. So much of this jewelry was found on the body of the pharaoh, but so much was also found in an array of caskets and boxes. And we've got Harry Burton's photographs, some of them digitally colored, and then we have the chests and boxes themselves. And they have the important hieroglyphic inscriptions on them. But they also have, if you look closely, written in the cursive hieratic script an audit at the time of the funeral as to what was to be found inside those boxes. We're talking about over 200 pieces of jewelry found significantly in boxes, but also, as we know, on the body of the pharaoh himself, and some bits and pieces lying on the floor. This particular box had written in that hieratic script the words "gold jewelry for the funeral, made for the bedchamber of Neb-Keperura." And Neb-Keperura is this throne name of Tutankhamun. And how should we interpret bedchamber? Sometimes it's interpreted as burial chamber, with the idea that the pharaoh is going to sleep as if for eternity. But we have all these wonderful, wonderful so-called pectorals worn on the chest of the pharaoh. 27 of them survive, many of them found in chests. And I love that example on the left found in this box. So let's just give you a full screen image of it. It is that scarab beetle rolling the sun disk. So it's the sun at sunrise, being adored by two baboons who are in fact manifestations of a lunar deity wearing the crescent and full moon headdress. So it's a cyclical idea of night following day following night. And it all takes place in a boat because for the ancient Egyptians, riverine transport was the way that the ancient Egyptians got about and a way that the gods got about. This is the cosmos. This is this duality of night and day, sun and moon. This is the importance of these ideas in relation to kingship and in relation to the Egyptian funerary religion. And these are recurring images. As I say, 27 of these pectorals. We're talking about 10 centimeters square. We're talking about pieces that were worn on the chest and giving us so much information about the ancient Egyptian funerary religion. And of course, I could give a whole lecture just on these. The image of the pharaoh between two key deities on the left there, the goddess Sekhmet, the god Ptah. The image of the falcon associated with the divine nature of kingship, the god Horus. The gods and goddesses, the pharaoh, represented in just a stunning iconography in a variety of materials, mostly available to the ancient Egyptians in Egypt, some of which was imported when it's lapis lazuli or when it's silver. And some of these pieces are definitely being displayed for the first time. I'm seeing them for the first time. Now there's a little room. It's more than a little room. There's a lot going on there off the burial chamber. So let's go into what we call the treasury. It was the only unsealed doorway. So if you're looking at my cursor there, you can see that there is a jackal sitting on a chest looking out. And this is the god Anubis. This was the only unsealed doorway in the tomb. Anubis was the god of protection in cemeteries and protection during embalming. And he was there guarding something very, very important behind him. Now, he was wearing, when this tomb was discovered, a linen robe. And of course, for the purposes of museum display, that linen robe has been removed. But it's interesting that the ancient Egyptians did tend to dress their deities. Now, Anubis is mostly painted black with some lovely, lovely gilding and the inlaid eyes that the ancient Egyptians so loved. Now, behind him in the gem display is what he was protecting in the tomb itself. So you can't quite make it out there in my photograph. So first of all, let's go back to Harry Burton's photographs and see that there is a gilded wooden shrine. We can see one side of it here. There is a goddess with her arms outstretched. In fact, this shrine has a goddess on each of the four sides. And inside that gilded wooden shrine with the friezes of cobras, we call them uraei, with the sun discs atop. So there's an element of inlay with the glazed composition ware faience, with glass which the ancient Egyptians were new to producing around this time. So it was something very special to them at the time. The glass was very highly valued at this time as a new material in Egypt. Inside that gilded wooden shrine, protected by goddesses, was an alabaster chest with 4 compartments. Those goddesses were also protecting the corners of the chest, and the 4 compartments had stoppers with images of the pharaoh, all on display in the gem. Inside each of the 4 cylindrical compartments of that chest was a solid gold, as you can see, about 40 centimeters in size, inlaid coffin. And each of these inlaid coffins had the embalmed and wrapped internal organs of the pharaoh. So we're talking about the lungs, liver, stomach, and lower intestine. And they have been displayed on top of the alabaster chest. Now, what's interesting is when you look inside these coffinettes, there is inscription. And there's been some really important recent research, particularly by the British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves, suggesting that the cartouches, the names of Tutankhamun, written inside these 4 canopic coffinettes, as we call them, he suggests, and others are more and more in agreement, that they have been rewritten, that this is recycled funerary equipment originally produced for someone else. And there are other examples where the names of the pharaoh just look a bit wonky and rewritten. And the same can be said for the cartouches, the names of the pharaoh, his birth name and his throne name, above the winged goddess, the sky goddess Nut here, another wonderful petrel, originally worn on the chest, found in Tutankhamun's tomb. And actually, when we look at some of these statues of the pharaoh, and we've always thought we're looking at images of Tutankhamun, they look really female. And it's suggested now that maybe some of this funerary equipment is the recycled funerary equipment of Nefertiti, whom we believe to be the stepmother of Tutankhamun, who, it's possible to argue, ruled Egypt alongside her husband Akhenaten right at the end of Akhenaten's reign, and then possibly ruled as a sole ruler before Tutankhamun ascended to the throne, or possibly was his regent right at the beginning of his reign. And it's just possible that these images are in fact images of Nefertiti as pharaoh, produced for her burial and then recycled for Tutankhamun's burial. It's a suggestion, it's a hypothesis, but it's gaining more and more traction in Egyptology. And actually, it's thought now that the funerary mask and the middle of the 3 coffins might actually again be recommissioned for Tutankhamun. Nicholas Reeves, again, is the person to read on this subject. His articles that I've put up on the screen there are available, freely downloadable on the internet, and they're worth a read. I say they're worth a read. So much of what we find on display, of course, relates to the funeral itself, of course, relates to the death and burial of this pharaoh. But the ancient Egyptians believed in a rebirth, a rejuvenation, and this was affected in a variety of ways. There was a key ritual that was performed on the mummified body. And when we visit the tomb of Tutankhamun, we see that the pharaoh who ascended to the throne on the death of Tutankhamun, an individual named Ai, not of royal blood, and all sorts of political intrigue at that period. It's a fascinating period of ancient Egyptian history. Ai is shown performing a ritual that the ancient Egyptians called the opening of the mouth. It's not an actual opening of the mouth. It's steeped in symbolism, but it was to rejuvenate the deceased Tutankhamun so that he would be reborn into the afterlife. And there is a chest on display from his tomb that has retractable carrying poles. I don't know of another like it. Surviving from ancient Egypt, it looks in pristine condition, and it was found full of interesting ritual items associated with the ritual of the opening of the mouth, of rejuvenation. And particularly important in the rituals was these faience or glazed composition ware Egyptian faience vessels, a type named Nemset for purification and a type named Hez or Hezet for libation. We're talking about 67 of them. Everything was done in vast numbers, not just in triplicate, but in multiple numbers of all kinds of objects. What we see less of elsewhere is the preservation of some of the ritual clothing. And for I to perform this ritual, he had to don a leopard skin. This singles him out as a priest performing the ritual. And of course, he was wearing an actual leopard skin imported from further south via the Nubian trade routes into Egypt. He wouldn't have been wearing the great head of the leopard skin. And so when we see in the painted scene on the wall of his tomb a leopard head, it is made of wood and gilded. These are on display. But what I love is the display, as far as I know, for the first time, of, on the left, a real leopard skin with some additional gold found in Tutankhamun's tomb. And on the right, there's imitation leopard skin, with the leopard skin print is turned into a stellar image with all the stars, which were also important to the ancient Egyptians, very much so, and to the ancient Egyptian funerary religion. So the idea of the pharaoh as priest, the idea of the pharaoh as upholder of the concept of order, the identity of the pharaoh is expressed through these stunning treasures. And I want to home in on just a couple of the scenes on the side of this particularly wonderful gilded wooden shrine. All these treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb, it is mind-boggling how they all actually managed to fit into that small tomb that we visit in the Valley of the Kings. So we see that particular shrine being carefully extricated from the tomb in Harry Burton's photographs. And we can go up close and see the image of Tutankhamun firing a bow and arrow into a flock of birds emerging from the papyrus marsh. He's got his pet lion by his side, and we know the lion was a symbol of kingship, and he's being handed the arrow by his wife. Now, this could be a wonderful leisure pursuit of the rich and elite and the royalty to go out hunting in the marshes, but it's much more than this. We know for the ancient Egyptians, the flock of birds is a symbol of chaos, and the pharaoh is shown overcoming that potential chaos. He is upholding a state of order. That is what we see in the iconography, together with scenes that are steeped in sexual symbolism. And this ties in with regeneration and eternal life. And we need to know the hieroglyphic script to understand what's going on here. Where we see the pharaoh pouring into the hand of his wife, we need to know that the ancient Egyptian verb to pour is actually the same as to father a child. So in fact, it's the same as to impregnate. So there is so much more than the surface literal, aesthetically pleasing iconography. This imagery is steeped in symbolism. In these shrines found in Tutankhamun's tomb, we have these 30 or so gilded statuettes of gods and of the pharaoh, all on display together for the first time. But again, we need to be reminded of how they were found. And we need to look back to Harry Burton's photographs to establish that these wonderful gilded wooden figures of God were originally found with linen clothing. They emerge from their shrines wrapped in linen, whether they're images of gods or images of the pharaoh here on the back of a panther in his role as destroyer of snakes. All these shrines we've got photographs of. I love the fact that they were just had boats heaped up on them. 22 resin blackened shrines were found with 35 models of boats on top of them, all shown piled up in the photographs taken by Harry Burton and now beautifully displayed in the gem. But what I love is that in addition to the gilded wooden figures, we've got these boats on display. We've got the resin blackened shrines on display. And more than that, we've got their little garments that they were wearing, carefully folded up, the linen shawls, carefully folded up and on display for the first time. Now, of course, any tomb will have a collection of these magical servant figurines, the shabtis of the ancient Egyptian burial. Tutankhamun had 413 of them. all displayed together for the first time, made of wood, made of Egyptian faience, made of painted limestone. Rows and rows of them. Stunning. They make for stunning photographs. They make for stunning viewing. And it really is a bit of everything, including baskets, organic materials that have survived for well over 3,000 years, filled with the original foodstuffs, whether it's dates, whether it's grapes, whether it's almonds, the food supplies that Tutankhamun wished to be sustained by for eternity. And it really is the sheer mass of treasures that is mind-boggling. And that's where I want to just end with a selection of slides which give you a feel for the contents of the palace stashed away into that tomb. It was hoped for eternity. The vast number of boxes in a variety of woods. The absolutely beautiful chairs. And for me, I have to say, it's those stools. I love the stools, and especially the folding stools. Look at those geese heads. The carving on them is just wonderful. I've always loved this one. It's an imitation folding stool. This is not going to be folded. You can see that it's a cowhide or maybe the skin of a Nubian goat that has been rendered in wood with ivory inlay. So it's an imitation folding stool. I'd never seen all the beds from Tutankhamun's tomb on display before, and they're displayed together with the 8 headrests that the ancient Egyptians used as pillows, although I think that some of these are just too fragile to have actually been used. And we know there's a symbolism to the headrest. We know that there's a spell in the Book of the Dead, number 166, that's ascribing magical protection to the headrest, and it's providing the deceased with sufficient air to breathe in the afterlife. So there's all sorts of a magical protective significance to some of these daily life objects. But I mean, look at that. Again, you couldn't have actually folded that headrest on the right. It's made of ivory, but it's got those protective images of the household god Bez sticking out his tongue, warding off scorpions and snakes and evil spirits. There's no way those glass headrests could have actually been used. They must have been ceremonial. And the ivory example, where the god Shu, the god of air, holds up the head of Tutankhamun as it was placed on the headrest, as if the sun in the heavens, guarded by those 2 lions, the lions of the horizons, the lions symbolizing yesterday and tomorrow. Stunning, stunning display cases, showcasing for the first time the more than 80 stone vessels, mostly of alabaster, vessels that still contained on discovery some of the scented oil, the scented unguent, perfume vessels, wine chalices made of alabaster, quarried in Egypt and then sculpted by those extraordinary, extraordinary artisans. But I'd like to end with the board games, because I have to say, it's these kind of objects of everyday life that connect one with this iconic pharaoh of ancient Egypt, connect with him as a living being, as a human being, and as a child pharaoh. And I love the fact that for the first time ever, we can see all the treasures discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb. And I really hope that one day you get to visit the Grand Egyptian Museum, because it is mind-blowing. And these objects are stunningly, stunningly displayed.
You, Lucia. It's not only the treasures in the museum that are mind blowing, but your talk as well. It was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us that journey into the Grand Egyptian Museum, which sounds like a place every single one of us has got to see in person. I'm sure people will have questions for Lucia.
Yeah, the sculpture of the baby Tutankhamun with the elongated skull, the shape of that reminded me of when you see where people have bound skulls. Is there any evidence of them actually doing skull binding either that time or any other time in Egypt?
Oh, that's a good question. No, there's no evidence at any time in ancient Egyptian history of any kind of modification to the skull or any kind of binding of the skull. So I think we do have to read this. We have to unpick the image of the pharaoh because we do not have true portraiture really at any point, I don't think, for ancient Egyptian pharaohs. I think they are always the expression of an ideology, that there's a message that's being projected. And that does change over time, or can change. But we have the head of Tutankhamun. That's one of the heads we're pretty sure of. You know, it's found safely in its tomb. And what's interesting is that Tutankhamun's skull is on the long side, but within the parameters of normality, but it is on the long side. We've got another body that we know for sure is a relative of his, found in a tomb known as KV55 in the Valley of the Kings. Sometimes it's suggested to be his father, sometimes it's suggested to be an uncle or a brother of his. And that too has a skull that's on the long side, but again, within the parameters of normality. So it seems to be a family trait. And I think that on the one hand, we might see an exaggeration of a family trait because those princesses were also part of that ruling family. So I think it might be a stylistic device. I do think that particular ruling family are projecting themselves as divine in a way that they never have been previously and never will be again in ancient Egyptian history. So I think they are being presented as extraordinary, and that they are choosing to emphasize certain possibly family traits to do that. But it's an interesting question, and there's no evidence for any actual modification or binding of the skulls. So I think we just have to consider why it is that they choose to represent him like that.
Any other questions that anyone would like to ask?
Yes, I have a question. How long does it take to do a sort of decent tour of the museum and have a chance to appreciate everything there?
I think the question was how long does it take to do to comprehensively visit everything in the Grand Egyptian Museum?
Right, yes.
Well, like any national museum, ideally one would spend a week there. But of course, on most tours to Egypt, one doesn't have that opportunity. Mostly people rush in and out of these museums in Egypt. And for most people, they want to see Tutankhamun's mask, see a few other things, and then leave. I mean, certainly with the tours that I lead for ASA, we spend most of the day, late morning through to late afternoon, because we feel that we really need a good few hours in the museum. So we get a good comprehensive time to explore the Tutankhamun Treasures Gallery. There's also the wonderful Khufu Solar Boat Gallery and those 12 chronologically arranged galleries. So we get some good time there. But of course, one always leaves any major museum feeling one would like to go back.
Thank you.
Lucia, do the local people pay a different sum to get into the museum from what foreigners pay?
Yeah. So in Egypt, all the sites and all the museums have a completely different price for Egyptians, and it's significantly less. I mean, it's a tiny amount compared to foreigners visiting the sites. And one sees a large number of Egyptians visiting the Grand Egyptian Museum, particularly. They're visiting it in their droves.
Well, I'd like you all please to join with me in thanking Lucia for a really fabulous talk. Lucia, thank you so much for sharing your enthusiasm, your expertise, and your incredible knowledge in this subject. And wow, what an amazing museum. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Susanna. Thank
Nelly,
you.
how are you?
Thank you, Lucia, very much.
Thank you.
Really wonderful. And thank you to ASA for hosting the lecture this evening. I hope you've all enjoyed Travel Tuesdays.
Indeed, we have.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.